Okay, so we are hoping to look through Exodus 1 through to 19 this week. Just to recap, Genesis, we started with God creating the world, and the purpose for that is to have rest in him forever and a perfect relationship with him. When Adam and Eve sinned, they lost that ability to have perfect rest because they lost their relationship with God. But at the same time, even though they were cast out of the garden and judged, and they did die in terms of their relationship with God, God was still merciful and enabled them to be in a position where he was going to be able to provide salvation. And he promised that he would through the seed of the woman. And so we see the consequences of sin, the fact that sin does in fact cause death and everyone dies, and then there's this big judgment at the flood where God pours out his judgment on all sin. And then we have Noah is like a new creation again, but then we have again sin, the spread of sin, and God's promise that he is going to provide salvation. And so when he calls Abraham, he makes these promises that are in effect a reversal of the curses from Genesis chapter 3. And the family of Abraham then carry the promise from one generation to the next. And we see that even though they're undeserving, because they all have problems, they all don't live by faith, and yet God still works through them. He is still working to fulfill the promises that he's made. But God's time frame is actually quite extensive. So he doesn't, from Adam to the next generation, provide the salvation of everyone. He is actually going to be working across history and gradually revealing more and more of what it's going to look like for that salvation to arrive in the form of the seed stomping the head of the serpent. So as the history of Israel develops, God reveals just a little bit more each time what that's going to look like. So at the end of Genesis, we see a not so small family, a fairly large family now, living together. There is a reuniting of the family after separation and an enmity between brothers. But what provides unity is forgiveness and self-sacrifice, which points ahead to what Jesus is going to do. But they're living outside of the promised land. But we can see partially that God is blessing the nations through Joseph, and the family is growing in number. So we see some are a partial fulfillment of God's promises, but when Joseph and Jacob die, they're both looking forward to being returned to the land and returning to the land. But they also have their sights set further than just a physical return. I think that their hope is not just this world, but a resurrection where they're going to be part of God's kingdom that's going to last forever. So there is this hope. It's not like explicit, but there is this hope. And we see in Abraham and Isaac, with them both, that there is this understanding that God has something more and is capable of resurrection, and that is part of his purposes. So there is a bigger understanding of the fulfillment of these promises than just a piece of land in the Middle East. I think that there is a hint of eternal fulfillment.
Where do you see that, Jacob?
Jacob says at the end of Genesis that you're going to leave this land, and you will carry my bones from here. So he actually points forward to the fact that they're going to be in Egypt for a long time, but he's going to be returned to the land. And obviously, he's dead. So he's not actually going to enjoy the land physically, but he is participating in the eternal promises of God, in his bones being returned to the land. But this is where God is going to work. And this is where God is. Joseph? No. Yeah.
Yeah, so you said.
I said, well, Jacob also.
Yeah,
Jacob also is buried in the land after he dies, and it's the same hope. So they actually take Jacob's body back, his sons do, but Joseph stays in Egypt until the whole Exodus. So his body isn't taken back to the land, and his final thing is that he was put in a coffin in Egypt. But his words say there is something. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. And at the end of Joshua, we get them burying his bones. In the land. But his hope isn't just a physical return to the land, because he's not going to enjoy it, but he sees an eternal fulfillment in some way.
Couldn't it just be like, that's the place of blessing, that's
Yes.
where I belong?
Yes.
Rather than a future.
Well, I think that it's both. There's no reason why it can't be both. I think that Genesis is a book that talks about the hope of resurrection. So I think that this hope that he has, it anticipates the Exodus, so it anticipates what God is going to do. But I think it also in some way anticipates an eternal work that God is going to do as well. So at the beginning of Exodus, it's almost like there's a complete reversal. So at the end of Genesis, Joseph is basically in charge and providing blessing, and there's God showing blessing to his people because they're in the best part of the land, they're thriving, and through them God is blessing other nations. But then we turn over and we get like an opposite Pharaoh. So there's a Pharaoh that knows Joseph and acknowledges what he's doing is good, and so in that he blesses Joseph and God blesses him because of that. Whereas now we've got a king that doesn't recognize Joseph, doesn't remember Joseph, and wants to curse this people group that's multiplied in his land, and he oppresses them. And so they're in slavery. No one seems to be receiving any blessing. They're not in the land, but they've grown into a great nation. So big that Pharaoh's afraid of them, because if they turn on him, he feels like that it's quite possible that they might encourage, or if another nation attacks, they might join forces with the other nation. to overthrow him. So they are under oppression. And this is actually, they're there for 400 years, which is a fulfillment of what Abraham says, or what God says to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, which we read last time, where God says, chapter 15, verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, or slaves is the other word, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So God has already said to Abraham, this is what's going to happen. And so the Exodus story starts after that 400 years. So they've been in Egypt for 400 years. They're oppressed, and it's time for God to act. There's an outline in this book that gives us kind of the four major sections of Exodus. Chapters 1 to 11, where they're enslaved. Chapters 12 to 18, their redemption. 19 to 31 is this idea of being in a covenant with God. That's where we get the 10 Commandments. And 32 to 40 is the tabernacle and the need for the tabernacle and the reason for the tabernacle. So that's kind of a general outline of Exodus. And we can see that actually more time is spent on the tabernacle in this book than anything else. Hence the importance. So we really need to understand what the importance of the tabernacle is to understand the importance of the whole book, because virtually almost half of the book is talking about the tabernacle. But the first half of the book, or the first 20 chapters, are the exciting chapters, the God acting chapters. And we get that Israel is oppressed, and God raises up a person to save his people. And he equips this person in amazing ways. He provides an amazing birth. In the history of the family of Israel, God's promises often come with, and the fulfillment of God's promises often come with, an exceptional birth story. Abraham, well, yes, but it's kind of the beginning. They're beginning from birth. There are exceptional circumstances. And it's almost like resurrection as well, because a baby from a barren womb is like bringing life out of death. Sarah gives birth to a baby boy. Then Rachel is also barren. There's barrenness in the family, and God brings life from these barren wombs. And then we have a baby boy thrown in the river that is drawn out of the river. And so if we think about the images that we have of the flood, where that is associated with death and judgment, to have a baby floating in the river, we see another picture of salvation coming out of death. So the boys were meant to be all thrown into the water, but God, and the language that they use when they describe the basket that she hides him in, they're the same terms that are used when they construct the ark. So they put him in, it's the same term. She took for him a basket. It's actually the same word in Hebrew as ark. And she daubed it with bitumen and pitch, which is the same stuff that Noah used when he made the ark. So I think that what
also wasn't it the reed, so the same word as Red Sea.
So there's this language that's used to remind us of the flood and the salvation that God provided in the flood, and drawing our attention to this baby that's going to provide salvation through judgment for this nation, because God has chosen to work at this time. So we have God revealing himself to Moses. God prepares Moses by putting him in the Pharaoh's court. And you would think that at that time he would be able to use his position of authority to help his people. And he tries to do that, and it doesn't work. And God still has another 40 years for him to wait on him to be used. But none of the training, for want of another word, that he received in that upbringing is wasted. So he can speak the language, he understands the whole workings of Egypt. Well, they were written by God's finger, so I don't know. But he obviously, he knew how to write. He knew, he had education, and he had access to all the riches of Egypt, which is why in Hebrews and Acts they talk about that he gave up that to identify with this people who were subject to oppression. So he gave up all his privilege in Egypt to side with this oppressed people, but it doesn't go so well, and he has to run away.
It's interesting too, the idea that he saw himself as a deliverer. So when he first acts when he's in Egypt, he actually goes, he rescues the Hebrew guy in the fight, and he kind of says he sees himself as this deliverer, but actually wasn't accepted by the people as that. And it's almost like God's has raised him up to be this deliverer, given him all the background, but it's actually 40 years of almost like working on his heart, like just waiting on my timing, and I'll make you the deliverer in my way, not in your way, which is interesting.
A significant verse at the end of chapter 2 is verse 24. And we hear that Israel are groaning. And in verse 24, it says, "And God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." So God hears, remembers, sees, and knows. And it's not like he'd ever forgotten, but it's when this language of God remembering comes up, it's not like he's forgotten, but it's identifying that God is now going to act on the promises that he's made before.
God is mentioned 5 times in that little section. So it's very much all about God and His time and what He's doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and we need to remember that He's actually, the timing is something that He's already preordained. He told Abraham that there were going to be 400 years. And maybe that's what has sustained this oppressed people for that time, because they know that God promised that they would be delivered.
He could have counted down.
Well, they could have,
When
yeah.
Moses turned up and said, yes.
Well, it's quite possible that, you know, this oppression of the baby boys was a something that, triggered the hope that,
But we also know
has
they're
been
not
the
very
only
good
time.
at listening, because when he also tells them what's going to happen at crossing of the Red Sea, and then they get there and they,
Yeah.
so
And there would have been a faithful few.
yeah.
And like Moses' parents must have been doing something.
Yeah, well, it was, I mean, and God gave him the gift of being able to be brought up by his mother to a certain age. So he knew not only Egypt, but he also knew Israel and Hebrew, which made him identify with those people rather than grasp for the power and the treasure that he could have had being a prince of Egypt. To quote a not so great movie. And so chapter 3 of Exodus is a chapter about identity. It's about Moses' identity and about God's identity. So, you know, Moses doesn't really know who he is. Is he a Midianite? He's married a Midianite woman. Is he Egyptian? She calls him an Egyptian. Is he Hebrew? You know, he doesn't know. And then God actually comes and says, this is who I am and this is who you are, and unites God's identity with Abraham's identity. So it's because I am the God of, well, because I am who I am, you are mine. You are who you are. And God declares that, yeah, you were right back then. You are going to deliver my people. And by now, Moses is like, oh, no. That ship has sailed.
I found that really quite endearing, in a sense, like it's very human there, that he kind of puts himself forward and it's like, yep, I'm the kind of the savior. And then he gets crushed and spends 40 years, his whole lifetime again, being a shepherd. And then when God does say, no, you are the right one, he's like, oh, but they won't listen to me because they didn't listen to me back then. So the God's like, well, they will now because the timing's right.
Yeah.
And it's my time.
Yeah. And we also keep getting pictures of God's people and God's leaders. Also, this image of shepherds keeps coming up. Abraham was a shepherd. Moses is a shepherd. Jacob was a shepherd. King David is going to be a shepherd. And then we finally get I am the good shepherd. So yeah, we just get glimpses, tiny little glimpses of what God is doing and how his salvation is going to take shape. But you can't really put it together until Jesus comes. So Moses finally accepts God's commission and obeys. And I would like to draw our attention to chapter 5, verse 2. Well, verses 1 and 2, but verse 2, because I actually think that this verse is quite programmatic for the whole book of Exodus, in that Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. They say, let my people go. But Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go. I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. And this idea of who is the Lord and why should we obey him, I think that is the central theme of Exodus. Who is God? Not just for Egypt, but for Israel. Like, you know, they have had this heritage that they hopefully have handed faithfully down from Abraham, that they are God's chosen people. But who are they? God is calling them out of slavery, but they don't really know who they are, and they don't really know who God is. And God is going to reveal himself not only to Pharaoh, but to his own people. And he's going to show them why and how he ought to be worshipped and followed. So I actually think that Pharaoh's question is the question of everyone who is reading this book, and gets answered through the book. So who is God? Well, he's going to show you he's powerful, he's good, he's a savior, he is just, he judges, he saves, he's merciful. So who is God? This is going to get answered in this book. And why should we worship him? That also gets answered. And how is also the answer. So God promises that he's going to deliver, even though things seem to get worse to begin with. And in chapter 6, we get God making a big statement. And can someone read chapter 6, verses 1 to 12, 13?
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." God also said to Moses, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, did not make myself. I also established my covenant with them, to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with an uplifted hand, to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as possession. I am the Lord." Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of his country." But Moses said to the Lord, "If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips?"
Excellent. So what are the big things that we see repeated here? Who is doing the action in this?
I am the Lord.
Yes. So I am, I have, I will. They're the things that are repeated, right? And so God, well, what's God saying here? Yeah, he's the boss, that he's faithful, that he's actually going to do what he promised to do.
I think he also is saying in verse 11, he actually doesn't answer the question. Moses says, "Who am I?" But they'll listen to him, which might be
stemming back from his bad experience in the past, where he was basing it on who he is. And God doesn't actually answer that question. He just says, this is who I am. And that's actually all that matters.
Yeah. And so he repeats again who he is, this name, I am who I am, which if you read your unit, there is this talk of the importance of the name of God, and how Yahweh is given to Israel to be used by them as their name for the sovereign and almighty God who acts in relationship to his promises that he has already revealed. And yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I can't remember whether it's in there or not, but it's really interesting when you read the Old Testament, you see Lord in cap. It actually means it's the word for Yahweh. So it's the personal name. Because another name like El Shaddai or whatever is Lord, is God, but it's not God's personal name. So when you say it, when like in Psalms, it might sometimes go, Lord, my Lord, the capital one is actually talking about Yahweh. That's just how it's translated. It's still being translated in as Lord, but it's actually the word for that personal name, which is I am.
It does come up in the Bible even before Abraham.
Yes.
Genesis, is it 16?
Yeah,
It's
so
when they call on, or maybe not that far, when they call on the name of the Lord, the people began to call on the name of the Lord. Yes, 4:16.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when it talks about the two lines.
Yeah, so I think that it's quite possible that they were using this name before Moses gets revealed the name in the 426. Have a 6 in it.
I've got the context.
So they may well have been using the name, but God wants to identify himself with this particular name as the relational God, and not just someone who's acted in the past, but this name is like a present continuous. It's past, present, future. God is always and has always and will always be who he is.
And it's at this point that he starts filling out who he is. Like from here on now, it's like, yep, this is my name, Jehovah, Yahweh, but I'm also filling out what that looks like because I'm making this covenant.
Yeah. Yeah. So God declares his name also in relationship with how he's related to his people. So I am the God of your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's in context of their relationship and how God is acting in accordance to his promises as well. So it's not just God the creator, God the savior. This is God who is and was and will be always acting in accordance to his promises and his relationship with his people.
That's what I said. So he, at this point, even though they've used the name in the past, here he reveals his name as, like you were saying, self-existent or powerful, but also in the context of redemption. So previously they'd had that name, they began to call it a name, but now it's in the context of this redemption.
So,
Because he says, I'm going to rest.
yeah, this is also in accordance with the promises that he's made. So it's like he's within his covenantal relationship. Is that is why we can relate to him in this way. Of course, he is sovereign, saving, and relational. So when we look at the next few chapters and we see all of these plagues and judgments against Egypt, we see God showing himself to be in authority over all the gods of Egypt, because basically these plagues on one level challenge the Egyptians' understanding of who God is, because they worship gods of the river, they worshipped frog gods, they worship like livestock. So there are like things in these judgments that are showing that God is sovereign over the Egyptian gods, but he's also showing his judgment to Egypt, reminding us of the promise to Abraham: those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse. And basically this nation, Egypt, has oppressed God's people, and so God is going to judge them for that. There's a few plagues that Israel suffers under as well as Egypt, but then God starts making a big distinction, and his people don't suffer the same judgment as the Egyptians, and he shows his favor to his people by not affecting them with the different plagues. Yeah. And also the Egyptian sorcerers are able to replicate in a small way and not very, like, they can't reverse it. They can do the same thing, but they can't reverse it. So, you know, it's like, yeah, they were able to turn water into blood, but that actually is not helping Egypt, is it? Because the water's already blood. Like, if they could turn it back, that would be helpful, but they can't. If they could send the frogs away, then that would be helpful, but they can't. So these, there's certain amount that they can do that mimics God's action, but they actually have no power to stop God's action. They have no power to reverse anything that God has set in motion.
Is there any explanation of how they can do that? Like, I don't know, it feels like
well, they talk about that they're magicians. I think they do use demonic powers, which, you know, I think that there are powers that may be harnessed, but no power is equal or to God's power.
You think about it in the New Testament, you see things where people are doing false miracles. But they're, yeah, so if it's not of God, then the other power to lead people, the goal being to lead people astray. But I think what Jules said about the plagues get increasingly focused, that God's kind of going, okay, starting up here, and yes, you can do these things, but I'm going to be increasingly showing you that I'm the powerful God. And I can, so you can do some things, but I'm going to protect my people. Focusing right.
Yeah, and Like God really does have a sense of humor, because, these magicians have been able to do certain things, but you get to the 6th plague and they could not stand before Moses because of the boils that came upon them. So they can't even go out there and confront Moses because they're suffering. So it's like God is making a little joke.
I think it's a good question though. A really
Yeah.
good question, because there is no doubt you see people do things that appear miraculous, but are clearly not from God. And so that's always a competitive fight if it's not from God. There's only one other place.
Where can they get that power?
Yeah.
Whatever it was, whether it's trickery or whether it was spirit. But they could turn the nail to blood too. So. The other thing I remember just from those podcasts we were listening to is it's like, well, what's the plan? Like, okay, wouldn't it have made more sense and shown more power if they could turn the nail back into water? Because all they did is make things worse. Because saying we're doing the same thing. They didn't fix it, but God fixes it. Like God reverses them. The magicians couldn't reverse what God had done. To begin with, they could do something similar through some sort of magic, but then eventually they couldn't do that either. But at no point could they reverse it. Only God could do that.
Yeah, and Pharaoh recognizes that he needs to ask God to reverse it, because he keeps saying, Moses, go and tell your God to take away this plague. And Moses does time and time again, and yet Pharaoh is unable to or incapable of acknowledging God's sovereignty and power. If we think in our understanding of Egyptian religion, Pharaoh was seen as a god. Pharaoh was seen as one of the ultimate gods, and for God to then, in the last plague, kill his firstborn son, this is a complete affront to their religion and their understanding. I guess chapter 12 is the important chapter in terms of understanding what the Passover is and what God's going to do in this final plague, where the rescue of Israel is going to happen. So after this, Egypt's going to be in such an uproar that they're going to tell Israel to leave, that they're not going to oppose them. You can go, and actually, why don't you take all this stuff with you? And so miraculously, they go and knock on the doors and go, have you got anything for me to take? And the Egyptians go, sure, have all my riches. Well, yes, and we do see that it's recorded later that a large multitude of Egyptians do follow with them.
Notice that I can't remember whether you're going to come to it, but it's an interesting, all the way through all these plagues. What's the repeat? Why are they asked to be let go? Well, what's the point? What's the purpose? That's what Moses says.
Yes.
So the whole thing is about freeing from slavery to worship, which is obviously really simple.
Yes.
We're freed. We are, if you think about the Testament, Paul's writings, we're freed from slavery to sin to serve,
to worship God.
Well, actually raises the question that what is worship? Because we have often think of worship as leading and singing, or worship's here in church, but that worship is serving.
Well, and for Israel, when they get out into the wilderness, worship is their whole life. Like God gives them these 10 commandments, but that is to be reflected in everyday living, is their response to this salvation. So we have salvation coming in the form of blood being placed on the doorposts so that death passes over those who are under that sign. I mean, this is obviously a very symbolic and points forward to a future Passover as well. Did you want to say anything about it?
About the final plague altogether?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just linking it in terms of Bible knowledge, what verse would you think from the New Testament comes to mind? That's really significant. You don't have to know the passage, no, you don't have to know the reference, just the
What passage that does what?
well, when you think about this, knowing this part of Israel's history, or about why is it so important that we understand this in terms of understanding what Jesus is doing or saying in the New Testament? Yes, no, I understand you. So particularly when he calls himself the Passover Lamb.
Yeah.
So that's actually 1 Corinthians 5:7, but I you know, and this is the blood of a new covenant that we do. So he is actually saying that they are celebrating Passover at that time. That's the Passover meal. But he's
Paul talking about.
yeah, Paul talking
Passover.
yeah, in Corinthians, but in the Gospels you can see that Jesus says we're going to celebrate the Passover. He has this meal and he says, "This is my blood shed for you." For the new covenant. So it obviously this is pivotal for them, and speaking as Jules was saying, forward to the total fulfillment of it.
So if we can understand this salvation, which points to a greater salvation, it just enables us to really understand why Jesus had to do what he did, and why it was so important that he would die, and that his blood is what shields us from the consequences of sin, which is death, which is essentially what happens here. And so when we look at chapter 15, even though Moses has led the people, who are they thanking and praising in this chapter? The Lord, yeah. Who's at the center? It's not a hard question. Yeah, who's at the center of this God? In a beautiful chiastic picture right here. Right in the middle, you have 11 and 12. Who is like you, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. And then there's two parallel sections, 4 through 10. They are celebrating the destruction of Pharaoh's army, so they're looking to the recent past. And then 13 through 17, they're looking to the immediate future, where God is going to do the same with the land of Canaan, where he's taking them, and then at the beginning you have that God is our strength and song, and he will reign forever. He's brought the people over the waters, through the waters of the sea, and Pharaoh's arms are drowned. So lovely hymns and song. And so God displays his glory in saving his people through judgment. And I guess there's these two big significant things that tend to get wrapped together, which is the Passover, which is God's salvation of his people from the judgment of death that went to Egypt. And then there's this crossing of the Red Sea, where he delivers them out of the hands of the enemy and takes them through the, like, almost the waters of judgment, because we see this picture again of judgment, but they're actually saved from that judgment, and Pharaoh and his army actually are judged and they're destroyed through those waters. And you get images of the flood again, this picture of the flood and the chaos that comes with the judgment of God, but Israel are rescued from that judgment. So there's these two events, but they're kind of wrapped up in the one thing. The blood of the Passover lamb and God taking them through the Red Sea. They're two events, but it's like one salvation. And so once they're in the desert, so what was the point of them being taken from Egypt? So let my people go so that they may worship. And so the first few chapters from 16 through to 19, when they arrive at Mount Sinai, God is showing his people who he is by putting them in situations where they actually have to depend on him. So they have seen him do great and miraculous things. And then as soon as they get into like this place away from the persecution of Egypt, they're placed in different situations. Now we have to remember that God is actually leading them. So he is leading them to places where there isn't any water. And he's leading them into a situation where there isn't any food. And so what are we looking at here? Well, what's their initial response? Is their initial response going to be, wow, well, God has rescued us from Egypt, so surely a bit of water isn't going to be a problem for him. But what happens? They complain. And so God is teaching them, he's continuing to teach them who he is through what he leads them into and how he provides for them. And so we have two instances of God providing them water, and then we have the manna. We've got the end of chapter 15 is about water. Chapter 16 is about the manna, and then the beginning of chapter 17 is about water. And so we get like a kind of a sandwich here. Jesus talks about these incidences and refers to himself as the bread of life and the living water. And so Jesus is basically, when he teaches, says he is the fulfillment of what Israel went through here.
John 6:33. Yeah, so you said this, that God is testing them or teaching them how to relate to Him in faith. Like He leads them to this, and it's a good. When people always say, "Why do bad things happen? Why do things?" God always has a purpose, and often He's growing us and teaching us of how to be people who are able to.
And I think that also, when the incidents of the manna, for example, He's teaching them about what it looks like to listen to Him and obey His word. Because if they obey Him, they're going to get the manna each day. If they disobey, we see that, the people who took extra because they thought, oh, well, maybe this is the only day it's going to happen and I need more for tomorrow, their manna went moldy and yucky. And they didn't need to do that. But then when He said, tomorrow you actually have to gather 2 lots because on the Sabbath day or on the day of rest, there won't be manna for you to gather. It'll already be there from the day before, so you won't have to go out. And some people didn't do that. And there was no manna for them. But those who listened and obeyed had what they needed for the next day. And it didn't go moldy. If they'd have done it the day before, it would have, but it didn't that day. So it's just showing how, what is very particular about how people are to obey Him. Like he says things for a reason. And so when we disobey Him because we think, oh, well, what does it matter? To God it does.
It's a good idea. People often don't think about the God of the Old Testament as that personally caring, nurturing God. But it basically says everybody had, those who collected much had only what they needed. Those who collected little had what they needed. Which is a very personal care. But yeah, do it, trust me. So it always just reminds me of God's prayer, give us this day our daily. Trusting God day by day for what we need. It's very, very hard. It's very hard. We do tend much more to fall down. It's just a really beautiful example of God saying, you can trust me for your daily.
And we also get, when God was doing the miraculous things in Egypt, the reason that He did it was that you may know that I am the Lord. We get this exactly also in chapter 16, verse 12. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So God is revealing Himself to His own people. In Egypt, He was revealing who He was, not just to His people, but to Egypt. But here, He's continuing this revelation of who He is. Because if they don't know who He is, why are they going to worship Him? As the Pharaoh said, why should I worship Him? But if they know who He is, they know that He's rescued them. They know that He loves them. They know that He provides intimately for them. Why wouldn't that lead you to worship? If you see God doing this, I can't see how it wouldn't lead you to worship apart from our hard hearts. And obviously we get a picture of what that looks like, in that they're grumbling and complaining, and they have hard hearts and they don't seem to be able to trust Him. And we're no different.
I see God do really miraculous things and then stood out. I find it very easy to be critical of them, like to go, hey, and then a pillar of fire and like, what's going on? But then we do the same.
And so we get to, they they cross the Red Sea. They have a few, well, there's, I think it's a couple of weeks of travel. So they've had some episodes of needing to trust God because he's led them to places where they need to depend on him for their provision. They need water, they need food, and God proves himself to be faithful, and then he leads them to Mount Sinai. And this is where he's going to remind them of the covenant with Abraham. He's going to establish the way that they can respond to him in faith for the salvation that he has already won for them. So I think when we talk about the law and the 10 Commandments, it's like people think, oh, you have to obey these rules so that God will look at you in favorably. But as we can see from the story, is that God already looks at them favorably. He already loves them. He has already actually saved them from their slavery. And so what's the point of, or what do you think the point of then giving them the law would be? Because he's already done the work. He's already showed them that he loves them. So what's the point of the law?
Partly continuing his revelation himself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So clearer picture of what goes on.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in seeing what the law looks like, we get a picture of God's justice and what he sees as good and right, and what things that he values. Yes, so there is that. So it's definitely a revelation of who God is.
Says you shall be a king of the priest.
Mhm.
You shall be to me a king of the priest, holy nation. So it's a way of using them to show the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So he shows who he is. He identifies what it looks like to be someone who follows him. So he defines their identity. Any other thoughts about?
Also shows they'll fail, so
Mm-hmm.
shows that they need someone to rescue them from that.
Yeah, so
It shows us.
so it shows God's standards and then our inability to reach those standards. Yep.
It's purity,
Mm.
total purity. It's interesting, when he says, do this with the food. Why do this with food? Because I'm teaching you what it means to live. Like I'll provide, and so trust me. And they don't yet know what it means to live as God's people. Like, okay, you're God, you've revealed your name, you've brought us out of Egypt. But what then? How then do we live our life? What does that even look like? And so it's showing them what it looks like to be God's royal priesthood, to be different. However, it's also showing them that they can't do it.
Yeah.
So it's both. This is the way. This is what but actually, there's this constant message that you're not going to be able to do with it, which is why there's always
And I think the other thing that it indicates is that it's showing them what their purpose is, having been redeemed. What is their purpose to worship, and what does worship look like? It looks like living in this way to reflect God's image. Because basically living out these words reflects who God is, because as Mary said before, God is revealing himself through this. And so therefore, when they're obedient to that, they're actually fulfilling God's mandate that he gave to Adam and Eve, was to be his image. So they're fulfilling their created purpose to be the image of God. So if they are a people that are chosen by God and have been rescued by God, this is their response to live in that way. So it's actually not a demand. It's actually showing them how they can lovingly respond to his goodness and his kindness and his rescue.
But it's also a revelation. Like they can't know it. These aren't things they could ever have worked out themselves. So it's a revelation, his character and who he is, and a teaching of what that looks like.
Did you say that was about food stuff? Underlying, like teach them to do?
No, I was just saying, like before, when you've got the manna, and he said, do it this way. So it teaches, I'm faithful to come. And like this is a massive expansion of that. You live, this is who I am, and this is how you live to it. So,
Yeah, so we will get to the food laws.
no, I was just
That will come next week, because next week we're going to look at the rest of Exodus and Leviticus, so those two chapters. So chapter two units in the book. So unit 6 and 7 are basically all about the commandments, the tabernacle, and Leviticus is all about the sacrificial system. So those are the things that we are going to kind of try and look through next week. So I guess in terms of reading for next week, essential Leviticus 16. And I guess if you can read, what it says here, 24 to 34 of Exodus. So Exodus 24 to 34, and then Leviticus, what one did I say? 16. I'm hoping that's the right one. Yeah, 16. Leviticus 16. Because that's the heart of Leviticus and the heart of the Pentateuch. We're going to get right to the center of the chiasm. So that's the plan for next week. Now, is there anything that you want to comment on or discuss or ask from your reading of Exodus up to this point that you might have had a thought about as you were reading? Nothing that jumped out at you? The thing that you wanted to go? Whether I understand this or happy with this or I have made a note here that I think is worth listening, well, remembering, is that what I've already said that Jesus, in terms of this idea of the water and the bread, actually says that he is the fulfillment of those things. But the New Testament writers often compare our situation with where Israel's wandering in the wilderness. So let just me read. The New Testament writers frequently compare the experience of Israel in the wilderness after their salvation and heading toward the promised land with our experience of salvation from sin and our wait for the fulfillment of the promises of the new heavens and the new earth. So we are in the same position now as Israel was here. So they are in between salvation and the promised land when they're wandering in the wilderness. And so the New Testament compares our situation, having received the salvation of Jesus and still awaiting our promised land, which is the new heavens and the new earth. And so they compare our journey, so to speak, in this life with the journey of Israel in the wilderness. And so we are going to experience in this life things that are going to challenge us to depend on God as we live, that we are going to be pushed into situations where we need to trust God, because he is leading us, he is sovereign over our lives, and he is there providing for our needs in each circumstance. And so, yeah, I think the New Testament want us to reflect on these passages as examples for us of how do we live in this now and not yet.
It is, and so also the idea that they were free to serve, we're free to serve. They were fed on manna. Jesus is manna, he is our food, he is relying on him for strength for everything to do day by day. They grumbled, and he says, when you grumble, you're grumbling against the Lord. Against. When we grumble, it's a grumbling against the Lord. Like it's revealing.
Yeah, so reading the Old Testament isn't just a history lesson. It's actually God's way to help us to understand our own situation. And the example of Israel, as it says in Corinthians chapter 10, 1 Corinthians 10, it's an example for us so that we don't do what they did, so that we don't grumble, so that we don't fall into idolatry, which obviously is so easy for us to do because it was for them. And so the New Testament writers actually point us to these passages so that we learn from them. It's helpful to read it and understand them so that we do learn from them. Yeah, and it's more than just a history lesson. But God is at work here. He is speaking, he is acting, he is providing salvation, he's providing for his people, and he is still doing that now for us in an even greater way. Any other thoughts or comments?
An interesting thing actually, as you read through, or even if you just think about that, how many times this period is actually quoted. Like, we just get it in Corinthians. Don't crumble like they did, they were all swallowed up, rip them, or goes, today, if you hear my voice, don't rebel as they did. So, you know, and there's so many times that it's referred back to fully understand this will helps us fully understand what we've been taught. So,
Yeah, and I always, I don't know, get excited when I see patterns and pictures in the Old Testament and see how they're fulfilled in Jesus. I've been listening to my friend Jim Hamilton for too long. I do like chiasms. I think it's a very amazing literary device, which, you know, we don't tend to use that much in our own culture and writing, but it's extensive in the Bible, and so it's fun to find it.
Like throughout history, because that actually shows us what we already know, that the Bible is the word of God, like even though, so when you see those chiasms like over that time, sort of reinforces that.
Yeah, and it shows that not only is the Bible God's word, but it's actually crafted in a way that it's a masterpiece. It's really a literary masterpiece that's put together by really creative in a super creative way by like you just don't have a human equivalent because it can only happen through the Holy Spirit and the work of the Spirit. So just shows you how amazing the Bible is as a piece of literature, apart from any other thing. So then when you acknowledge that God is the sovereign author, and we can see how all the Old and New Testament connect up, and how the Psalms reflect these first 5 books of the Bible, how the prophets rely so heavily on these books of the Bible, and how basically all the history from Deuteronomy, from the end of Deuteronomy, so from Joshua through to Jesus, basically are based on or are judged by or in accordance with these books. It's really foundational to know these books and understand them for a big picture of the Bible. Excellent. I'm going to stop it. And we can pray. Yeah.